was going to summarize the one word that I think will characterize today's discussions, it would be justice. Because this is something I think you're going to hear that Bill has really folded into his environmental and climate activism in a brilliant way. It is also a big part of what each of our subsequent speakers today are going to be discussing. Ethical AI, privacy, the considerations that companies have to have, how software can make a big difference in enterprises where the issues of equity have become more important than ever, and at least some companies are really eager to do the right thing. So we do want to get right started with Bill. So thank you so much for being here, Bill.
Well,
really,
a pleasure. It's a pleasure to get to join you, and I will just warn you in advance that as strong as the tech economy is, those of us who live in rural America still suffer from bad internet connections. So if I flicker or disappear at some point, I will get back to you as quickly as I can. But,
okay, well, we will just keep our fingers crossed on that one, but thank you so much. Listen, I see you have your 350 t-shirt on, which is apt. I didn't even introduce you yet. Let me quickly do that. Bill is a legendary journalist who's become a major league activist. He wrote The End of Nature, that came out in 1989, a catalytic book for understanding of how grave the world's climate and environmental situation was and was becoming. He's continued on that and related themes over many years. In 2008, he began an organization called 350.org, which he still leads, trying to emphasize the urgent problem of carbon reduction. I think the world may be slowly catching up to Bill, but I want to find out what he thinks about that. We're in such a strange moment now where everything is seen in a different light. We're at least showing some parts of the world we can collectively respond to an existential crisis. But I know that's really what we face when it comes to climate. So, Bill, how would you summarize where we are when it comes to climate and pushing back against the disaster that could befall us?
Well, it's a good question, of course, with long and complicated answers, but let me provide a couple. One is we're on a rapidly heating planet. In fact, today, a new set of studies indicating that 2020 is likely about 80% chance of being the hottest year we've ever measured on this planet, which would be remarkable because all the other record hot years have come with an El Nino in the Pacific. We don't need that anymore. There's so much carbon in the atmosphere, so much extra heat trapped that the temperature just keeps going up and up and up. We've raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit so far, and that's already causing havoc. We've lost half the summer sea ice in the Arctic. We see dramatic changes in the way that the water moves around the Earth. In dry areas, we see more drought, and with it, massive outbursts of wildfire. It's hard to remember now because it seems so long ago, but 2020, this annus horribilis began with all of us staring slack-jawed as the continent of Australia half burned to the ground. Once that water evaporates up into the atmosphere, it comes down in deluge and storm. We just saw the 6th named storm in the Atlantic, by far the earliest we've ever gotten to that mark in the course of a year. That's with 1 degree Celsius. We're on a path right now to raise the temperature, even if people kept the pledges they'd made at Paris, about 3.5 degrees Celsius. If that happens, we won't be able to have civilizations like the ones we're used to. That's simply, I mean, that takes us to levels of carbon and levels of temperature far beyond what any hominid has observed on this planet. So that's the bad news. The good news about where we are, if you want some, is A, There are big, powerful movements that didn't exist 10 years ago, and they're beginning to be able to check the power of the fossil fuel industry to dominate our politics. You saw this week a few massive pipeline projects come undone because of concerted opposition over decades. And it's wonderful to be a small part of that. 350 was a kind of first iteration, a kind of beta, if you will, for the climate movement. And now we have, climate striking high school students. We have the Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion and many, many more. The other thing that's happened, and this really is important news, is that our brothers and sisters in labs around the world have spent the last decade bringing the cost of solar power and wind power down by about 90%, and now storage batteries are following the same curve. That's by far the most important technological development on Earth, because it means that if we really wanted to, we now have the means to move pretty quickly to a new energy system that wouldn't take temperatures to those same heights.
Well, it's sort of daunting, I would say, to say the least, that even if we meet the Paris Climate Accords goals, we will warm to a level that is unacceptable. So what's your general thinking about whether we can do what we really need to do, which is astonishing to think that this is what we have to do, given how difficult it is to even get to the Paris levels at the moment. But how likely is it in your mind, honestly, realistically, that we will succeed in fighting back to avoid planetary catastrophe?
Well, I think it's an interesting question that we don't really know the answer to. This is an experiment that's happened 4 or 5 times in Earth history, where massive changes in atmospheric carbon levels, and they've all ended badly. But the last one was about 70 million years ago. So we don't know exactly how it's going to play out. The best we can say is, and the best scientific advice we've gotten comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN effort to get the world scientists together on this. In October of 2018, they published a report saying that unless we'd made fundamental energy transformations by 2030, which is not very far away, and they defined that as cutting carbon emissions by half, the chance of meeting those Paris targets go from slim to none.
That's just the Paris targets.
Yes, exactly. And one as close to 1.5 degrees temperature rise as possible. Now, even beginning to do anything like that depends on enormously stepping up the pace at which we're making change. Obviously, the US isn't doing anything like that right now, and clearly won't as long as we have a buffoon in charge of the country who operates on the principle that climate change is, quote, a hoax invented by the Chinese. At the moment, our country is a laughing stock of the planet for many reasons, but this is certainly one of them. And so we will see. The first key thing for progress is getting the fossil fuel industry out of the way. That's begun to happen. The work that people have done over the last decade has really helped. The fossil fuel divestment movement's become the largest corporate campaign of its kind in history. We're at $14 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested in part or in whole from fossil fuel. That's put enormous pressure on the industry. So now are the big attempts to get banks, asset managers, insurance companies to put pressure on to kind of cut off the money pipeline to these guys. You saw earlier this year, BlackRock, the biggest asset manager in the world, make fairly profound announcements. We'll see whether those translate into serious action or not. But certainly, the mood is changing. And assuming that we can get Trump out of there, it's possible that in this country we'll begin to make quicker action than we have in the past. But that's why a lot of the focus is on Wall Street. Washington no longer runs the world. To some degree or another, Wall Street still kind of does. So action there is likely to be swift and global.
So you're not opposed to working with business if they're willing to do the right thing. I mean,
Uh,
yeah.
no, I'm not opposed to working with them, but I spend most of my time working at them. uh, I mean, in my experience, American business has certainly the fossil fuel industry only responds to direct pressure, people going to jail, people blocking their funding, so on and so forth. And the rest of American business has basically stepped back and let the fossil fuel industry have their way politically. I mean, it's true that we see company after company making announcements about how their delivery vans are going to run on electricity or something, which is good. But what we really need are these vast, powerful technology enterprises to be turning over their lobbying arms in Washington to getting stuff done on climate change instead
Have
of.
you seen any of that?
Not really. I mean, every once in a while you get some noise, but you can tell that not much is happening by the fact that Congress has never felt any real pressure to act on any of this. We need way more than good words, and it's not. It's not. It's there are strong linkages in many ways between the work that's going on about racial justice in this country right now and the work that's going on climate. And some of those are just obvious. I mean, the people who suffer the most from climate change are the people who do the least to cause it. There's a whole nother series of stories just out this week talking about the way that the fossil fuel industry has turned parts of this country into sacrifice zones, and the people who live in them are invariably people of color. Asthma rates are 3 times as high. I can't breathe has many meanings. It can come from police brutality, and it can come from having a coal-fired power plant down the street from where you live. But there's also a powerful tendency of corporate America to pay lip service to these kind of problems with not as serious as we need it to be.
When you see something like Microsoft saying that they're not only going to become carbon neutral, that they're in a relatively near-term way going to be carbon negative for their entire existence, does that hearten you a little bit? I mean, that's a company we know well, we talk to a lot, we admire for some of their stances. Do you admire that kind of a thing?
Sure, it's always useful to hear, but I'd rather hear Microsoft, which has one of the biggest lobbying forces in the world, saying, we're going to be making sure that every congressman who hears from us understands that what we want them to do is pass serious climate legislation.
Okay.
When we hear the Amazons of the world talk about this, we need them saying, what, we're not going to hand over our AI anymore to the fossil fuel industry to help them find more oil and gas to extract, on and on and on. We really need to understand that this is an existential threat. In some ways, the first existential threat the whole planet has ever faced at once. And you can't be kind of doing this halfway. We've got a decade or not much longer with real leverage to do something about it. So now's the time to step up if you're going to step up.
Okay. So when you look at technology as a phenomenon, I mean, one of the things that I've been a little confused about from the environmental movement generally is, absolutely, the fossil fuel industry is in the way, but there are a lot of, you talk about the innovation around sustainable energy. I mean, that is business.
Yeah.
And I was heartened, by the way, to see that in the Democratic platform, they're talking about 500 million solar somethings as part of Biden's, it wasn't entirely clear what it is they're advocating, but clearly there's an appetite for more technology that could help here. Is there any technology that you think is especially promising, or are you sort of the view that talking about that too much takes the pressure off where we need to be putting it to get the carbon emissions down?
Not at all. I talk constantly about the technologies that are here and ready to go. Sun, wind, and increasingly batteries. These are clearly the way that we're going to have to quickly move to power the world. And happily, they're now capable of doing this. Quickness in particular. People are building giant offshore wind farms, ones that supply far more power than huge coal-fired power plants even. And they're doing it in a matter of months, start to finish, 18 months to get the tech up and running. That's really remarkable. This is nimble, flexible, interesting technology. And if you think about it, it operates really on the principles that we've come to understand as the kind of hallmark of new technology. The old energy system was highly centralized. A few huge coal-fired, gas-fired power stations that ran electrons to you down a series of wires that went one direction. This is not unlike how information in our world worked 20 or 30 years ago. You and I grew up in a world where there were 3 or 4 big TV stations that ran information one way down at us. Now in our communications world, we live in a world where everybody is a producer and consumer of information, where there's an enormous traffic back and forth of information. That's what we need right away when it comes to electrons. We need millions of solar panels on millions of roofs, thousands of wind farms and solar farms. We need them all interconnected. We need the storage batteries allowing us to do things like turn a fleet of electric vehicles into a giant storage grid. None of this stuff is futuristic or impossible. In fact, all of it's here. It just needs us to push it hard quickly. And that's the good news. There's no magic required. The magic, in a sense, David, I did a series of pieces for the New Yorker not long ago. I was over in Africa watching people who'd never had power before get it for the first time, thanks to solar power, which is now cheap enough and adaptable enough that you can get it out into remote places and begin to service the 700 or 800 million people on this planet who have no electricity at all. And when you're in a place where no one's ever had power before, for us, if you get a solar panel, it just kind of replaces what was there before. It doesn't really change. But when you're in a place where for the very first time, someone has a refrigerator, a light bulb, a fan, and they got it because they're able to point a sheet of glass at the sun, and out the back flows modernity. That's a Hogwarts level miracle, that really is magic. And it's worth appreciating it and being very grateful to the researchers that have made it possible. And it makes it all the crazier that we're not, that our societal goal hasn't been to be just deploy this stuff at as fast as we possibly can.
Okay, we're getting a lot of interesting questions, and I want to go to them in just a second. Josh will help with that. But the thing that I am wondering, given this extraordinary moment we're in, is this issue of a zeitgeist shift and a sort of a consciousness elevation which it seems to me to take the effort at the level that you are so clearly articulating is necessary. We have to have some kind of collective reset of our sense of priorities here. And so, and I know that you have, and you mentioned it earlier, the connections between the climate movement and the social justice movement that's so profoundly underway now. When you look at the possibility of a consciousness shift, how optimistic are you, and what specifically do you think we should all be doing to help improve the likelihood that that would happen?
Well, let's talk for a minute. Let's frame it in a different, in another way that's kind of useful for our thinking. What have we spent all year thinking about the coronavirus pandemic, which is actually not a bad analog for the climate crisis?
Well, it could very well be climate related for that matter. Yeah.
So the key lessons, it seems to me, are one, reality is real. you can't make the CO2 molecule compromise or negotiate. Chemistry and physics will do what they're going to do, just as despite all the efforts of some of our leaders, you can't force the COVID microbe to behave differently than it behaves. Biology sets the rules. If it says wear a mask, then wear a mask. Second thing, and this is a corollary, speed really matters when you're dealing with reality. Look, the US and South Korea had their first COVID death on the same day in January. The South Koreans went to work right away. They did what needed doing, and as a result, it's not exactly in the rearview mirror, but they haven't had to overturn their society. We didn't do anything. We just waited and delayed. Yesterday, one day, there were more coronavirus cases in the state of Florida in one day than there have been total in South Korea since this thing started. That gives you some sense of what happens when you don't take things seriously. February in the US, when our president was playing around instead of doing anything, is the equivalent of the last 30 years when it comes to climate policy. Clear warnings from scientists, no action. Now we need to move super fast. Third thing, and this goes most directly to your question about zeitgeist, what else does this teach us? And this is an important lesson for, I think, technology to learn, because Silicon Valley has been in the grips of a kind of libertarian fantasy of its own. What it really teaches us is social solidarity is absolutely necessary. Look, I've spent most of my adult life in the political shadow cast by Ronald Reagan and his notion that markets solved all problems. What was Reagan's famous laugh line in his speeches? The 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Ha ha ha. Turns out that the scariest words in the English language are, "We've run out of ventilators," or maybe "the hillside behind your house has caught on fire." Okay, and you can't solve those, by just your own individual efforts. It requires working societies to make them happen. And I'm afraid we're getting pretty good sense right now of what an unworking society America has managed to become. The fact that we're the country on earth least able to deal with climate change, with COVID, is probably reflects the fact that we're also the only society on earth that's decided to pull out of the Paris Climate Accords and not even try to solve the biggest problem that we faced. So the zeitgeist change is about looking out for each other. The technological change is about using the sun and the wind to power our world. And they're not unrelated even in that, because look, one function of a fossil fuel economy has been to exacerbate the inequality in wealth and power that dominates our world. Why are the Koch brothers the biggest political players in our country and have been for decades? It's because they're our biggest oil and gas barons. They had the money to purchase a political party, which they used to make sure that we wouldn't take action on these things. Why do we pay attention to the country of Saudi Arabia? Because they've come up with an interesting new approach to political life? No, they cut people's heads off with swords, but they sit on top of most of the world's oil. Well, the good thing about sun and wind is that it's everywhere. No one controls its supply, and hence moving in that direction will help rebalance some of those inequalities. There'll be rich people from sun and wind, but they won't be Exxon rich, for the simple fact that when the sun comes up in the morning, it actually delivers the energy for free.
Great. Okay, well, Josh, let's go to a couple of people from the audience here and see. I've seen several on the theme of nuclear power. Maybe we can.
Yep, we're gonna shoot over to John Suter.
Bill, I met you a couple times in San Francisco. Not too long ago, you said that the question is no longer a question of science, but a question of economics. But I'd like to switch that a little bit and say, why have journalists and the media not really focused on how people gather and filter information? And it seems to me most journalists that I talk to, both environmental journalists and other journalists, they always want to be the kid with the most important news, you know? And yet they're not able to stand back and really see how people process information. You know, Herb Simon, the guy the Nobel laureate who really studied how people make decisions in organizations, said that a lot of the assistants in the CEO's office will bring all this information and dump it on their boss's desk, and the boss didn't like it very much. And I think that there's not been enough study of how people make decisions and how information moves among people, because I think if we did this, we could really get constituents in the red states to start writing letters to their congressmen. As it is, they don't have to think about the issues that you bring up.
Well, I mean, I think that these are really interesting questions about information that I think about a lot, of course, because I'm a writer and at heart, and I do a weekly climate newsletter for the New Yorker. So I sort of see everything that comes across the transom. Look, the key thing to understand here is that we're dealing with a deeply poisoned well of information. And we understand this now in a way that we didn't before. Great investigative reporting from the LA Times, Columbia Journalism School, Inside Climate News over the last 5 years has left no doubt that the fossil fuel industry knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s. We had good scientists studying it who came up with uncannily accurate forecasts of what the temperature and the CO2 concentration would be in 2020. And they were actually believed within their organizations. Exxon started building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. But, and here's the important part, they didn't tell the rest of us. Instead, they invested billions of dollars, all these companies, in building a kind of architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that kept people locked for 30 years in a completely phony debate about whether or not climate change was real. A debate that both sides, remember, knew the answer to at the beginning. It's just one of them was willing to lie. And that lie has been the most consequential lie probably in human history. It cost us 3 decades that we're never going to get back, and it may turn out to have been the crucial 3 decades. And more to the point, the lie went very deep, as lies tend to do when you have billions of dollars to push them with. I mean, that's why, people like Donald Trump don't believe in climate change. The good news is, and it really is good news, that people have fought back effectively against those lies and built a real movement that challenges them. And we've begun to see its effects. The polling data indicates now that even in America, heartland of climate denial, about 70% of people understand that this is a real problem caused by humans that we've got to deal with. They may not completely get its urgency, but even that's changing. During the Democratic primary, the polling showed that climate change was either the #1 or #2 issue for Democrats in general, and among people under the age of 35, it was far and away the biggest issue that was on people's minds. So credit that to movements, credit it to the Greta Thunbergs and the Sunrise movement, also credit it to the powerful educational efforts of Mother Nature. At a certain point, if your city has been breathing wildfire smoke 4 of the last 5 summers, you're just going to say to yourself, who do I believe, Fox News or my own lying eyes, And so we're at a point where I think public perception is no longer the main problem, and converting the last 30% of people is no longer the main task. The main task is taking that 70% and turning it into a force that demands immediate, urgent, profound, sweeping action.
Thanks. That was great.
Thanks.
Josh, next.
Next we'll go over to Thomas Potter. Had a question about sort of these jobs and jobs displacement. Thomas, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hey, Bill. It's nice to see you again. We met when I was a high schooler at the Adirondack Research Consortium in Lake Placid, which was quite a while ago. Um, so my question or comment is legislation like the Green New Deal and other movements like the Maryland Sierra Club's Beyond Coal initiative involve transitioning toward renewable energy technology while offering training and education for workers that work in those outdated industries. But the common talking point from the right usually is that this technology shift will leave workers in coal country jobless, which is something you could see in full effect in, for example, Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s efforts to improve the health of West Virginians near Coal River Mountain in the early 2010s. So my question is, we have this plan that involves this just transition even for the workforce in these industries, but how do we make the point clear that we're not just looking to put every coal miner out of a job?
It's a really good question, and we've got to keep stressing it over and over and over again. I'm spending the afternoon going to interview a fellow in North Dakota who's got a big operation teaching people who've been working in the oil field and are out of jobs how to do wind, how to be technicians on wind farms. And the truth is, as you know, that as we move towards renewable energy, the number of jobs will dramatically expand. That's because fossil fuel tends to be heavily capital intensive, and renewable energy tends to be quite labor intensive. In fact, the possibility for a deep jobs bonanza of the kind we desperately need as we're going to try and come out of this COVID recession lies entirely with the task of retrofitting buildings to make them energy efficient, putting solar panels on roofs, on and on and on. All these are things that, no one's going to put their house on a boat and send it to China to get it insulated. This is work that has to get done here and can be a huge boost. And so we need to keep making that point, talking about it, pushing for it. The truth is that the Republican Party decided that it would be in its political interest to kind of hold coal miners and others as hostages. They've defeated every attempt at that kind of retraining money and things because in political terms, it's more useful for them to have Donald Trump pretending to the coal industry, coal miners, that somehow he's going to get their jobs back. That obviously isn't going to happen because the economics are no longer there to support it, never mind the fact that it's wrecking the earth. That doesn't mean that people who, through no fault of their own, have spent their lives engaged in what was necessary and useful work for our societies should be impoverished as a result. We have plenty of resources to retrain to people and revitalize communities doing necessary and important work.
I think we have time for one more, Josh, right?
Yeah, we had one that asked me to ask on their behalf. So, Bill, you've talked a lot about the creation of energy. You briefly touched on battery technology. I think that's something that everyone's, we can create it. How do we store it? So, one of the questions here was moving from sort of chemical harmful batteries to renewable batteries. Are we there? How do we create them? Where are we in progress of that?
Well, so batteries are really important because obviously by their nature, renewable energy sources are intermittent. The cloud passes in front of the sun, the wind dies. So in order to have a system that works mostly off sun and wind and hydropower, you need storage of various kinds. And there's many ways to store energy. Batteries are one of the most useful because they're easily dispatched and so on. But there also have been among the more expensive. And that's beginning to change. In fact, it's changing quite quickly as we ramp up volume. With both, with solar panels, with wind turbines, and with batteries, we still seem to be very much in the sweet spot of the learning curve where every doubling of installations drives costs down dramatically. That's something, and I noticed there's some questions about, say, nuclear power. Yeah. That's something that's not as true of mature technologies, certainly not true of the fossil fuel industry. And I mean, at the moment, the biggest problem with nuclear power is simply that everybody knows that, the the particular physical threats that might go with it, but mostly it's really expensive. And maybe we'll have new technologies at some point down the road. It doesn't look like they're going to come into play fast enough to make much difference in the 10 years, 15 years when we're really going to have to be bending this curve. That's probably going to be the work that's accomplished by sun and wind above all over that period, and everything else will be more towards the margins.
Thank you so much, Bill. This has been a great conversation. We could go on. I applaud your longtime activism, and we all, I think most of us at least, absolutely support this direction. We're going to do our best at Techonomy to keep these discussions going, because we have no choice but to continue them. So
Thank you all very much. A real pleasure, David, to get to talk with you and everybody else.
thank you for